Well, ladies and gentlemen, hello again. Welcome to another Reflected Reality Simulations video. My name's Graham, this is X-Plane 11 and the Hotstart TBM 900. This is part 3 of the video series. In parts 1 and 2 we looked at an IFR flight from Glasgow Airport in Scotland up to Aberdeen, and it was a fairly normal IFR flight, just the same as you'd expect to find anywhere in the world. We remained inside controlled airspace for the whole flight. Today is something slightly different. We're going to take off out of Aberdeen, but rather than join the airway structure, we're going to fly outside controlled airspace down towards Dundee. So we've taxied out to the runway hold short line here. Everything on the taxi out is done. We've still got the before takeoff procedure to do, so I haven't selected the flaps just yet. We're going to get airborne, fly up to an altitude of 3,000 feet on the runway heading, then we're going to turn left and intercept the radial 200 from the Alpha Delta November VOR. Course pointer 1 is also showing that VOR, and course pointer 2 is showing the automatic direction finder information. On the G1000 flight plan, we've simply got Aberdeen to Dundee. There's no route in there whatsoever. We're going to use the radio aids as far as possible. I do have the approach for the ILS at Aberdeen loaded, and there's minima in here of 750 to allow us to circle to land. So we'll make the approach to runway 09 at Aberdeen and circle to land on runway 27. We'll talk about some of the differences on the UK airspace as well, but we've got a little bit of time airborne to do that. So without further ado, let's do the checklist and get ready to go.
Mike Bravo Mike, I have an amendment to departure clearance. Advise ready to copy.
Well, that's unexpected. Let me just get a pen.
Go ahead for Mike Bravo Mike.
Mike Bravo Mike, after departure maintain runway heading. Climb altitude 6,000 feet.
Okay, after departure, it's the runway heading, climb altitude 6,000 feet. Mike Bravo Mike.
Mike Bravo Mike, read back correct. Advise when ready for departure.
Wilco, Mike Bravo Mike.
Oh well, I guess we're going to have some air traffic control for this flight. So the clearance was to 6,000 feet and maintain runway heading, so I'll do exactly that. We've got the course pointer, the heading bug, 340 degrees and 6,000 feet. Let's get the procedure done and then we'll call ready. So I'll put the pitot and the stall heaters on, select flaps to take off. I'll check the trims. We'll check the CAS system, inertial separators on, that's fine. Battery charge current is low. Landing field elevation is acceptable. We've got course pointer or CDI set correctly. Takeoff FMAs, flight director is there and cleared as altitude is 6,000 feet. Landing lights are going on and everything else is set, ready to go. Well, this is new. I guess we'll tell air traffic control we're ready.
Mike Bravo Mike's ready for departure.
Mike Bravo Mike, cleared takeoff, runway 34, surface wind 270 degrees, 5 knots.
Clear takeoff, runway 34. Mike Bravo Mike.
Excellent. Well, off we go then. It does sound somewhat like Bring Your Child to Work Day at air traffic control. Not to worry. So clear to take off, runway 34 and the wind is 270 degrees, so expect a slight crosswind from the left, only 5 knots. So notice I'm getting airborne with the flight directors in takeoff. It's not a great idea to arm the heading mode before you taxi out on the G1000. There's a few little gotchas on the real thing in there, or certainly there were a few years ago. So I'll leave the flight directors take off to keep wings level. Of course, once we get airborne, we can go into heading mode. So I'll hold it on the brakes. I'll bring the torque up to approximately 50%. That should get the prop RPM into the green. Release the brakes and advance the power to just underneath 100% torque. Keeping the aircraft on the centerline, and we'll rotate around about 90 knots today. There's 70, 80 and 90. Positive climb, gears coming up. Follow the flight directors initially, maybe just a touch on the low side. I'll put the heading mode in, and as we get to 115 knots, I'll select flap 0, flaps up, yaw damper in, autopilot in, and we'll go into vertical speed mode.
Mike Bravo Mike, contact Aberdeen radar 119.055. Good day.
Radar now 119.055. Mike Bravo Mike. Bye now.
Okay, we're in heading, we've got the autopilot yaw damper in, plus 1500 feet. I'll change frequency and give them a call.
Aberdeen radar, good day. Mike Yankee Tango Bravo Mike. Heading 340 degrees, passing altitude 2,200, climbing altitude 6,000.
Mike Bravo Mike, identified on departure. Left turn approved, own navigation, climb altitude 6,000 feet.
Okay, left turn approved, and climb altitude 6,000 feet. We'll intercept the 200 radial from the Aberdeen VOR. Mike Bravo Mike.
Okay, here we go. So round onto a heading of about 230 degrees. I'll push nav and that gets us VOR in white, so it's armed to capture that radial. I've got vertical speed of 1500 feet per minute because there's no terrain issues here now above 3000 feet. And reasonably, once we get above 5000 feet, there's no terrain issues most places in Scotland. So looking at the radio aids that we've got displayed, we've got the course deviation indicator for the VOR. The tail of the needle is also telling us the radial from the VOR, and the ADF is pointing at an NDB on the approach to Aberdeen. We'll change that in just a few minutes. Aircraft's captured the VOR correctly. Just monitor, make sure it does a good intercept. It's only 3 miles away from the VOR, so it may be taking a few attempts at this. It looks like a good job just now. If it doesn't do what I want it to do, I'll simply put it back into heading mode and force it to re-intercept, but it's doing a good job. Now that it's captured as well, I'll just ease the torque back a little bit and switch off the inertial separator. I'll keep an eye on the torque as that test separator moves. Yeah, that's a good intercept. 1,000 feet to go. See the torque just increase slightly as the separator is turned off. There we go. And just about to level off. There's alt capture at 6,000 feet. Now rather than accelerate, I'm simply going to select around about 60 gallons per hour by bringing the torque back. 60 gallons an hour should give us just over 180 knots cruise. I tend to use 60 gallons an hour for medium to low altitude cruise as an economy cruise setting. There's other power settings in the manual. Now, let's have a talk about the airspace. So this is the Aberdeen control zone. I can zoom out a little bit on here, but I've also put some charts onto the iPad device here. So by using a software package called Little Nav Map, I think it is, I've been able to generate something very similar to what you'd see on a VFR chart. Let's try and understand a little bit about the UK airspace structure. So if I zoom out just a little bit, we can see some Class A airspace here, some Class D airspace here, and nothing marked on the chart here. If you're in North America, then this airspace here would be Class Echo airspace, Class E. Now if you're in Class E as an IFR aircraft, you are in controlled airspace. If you are a VFR aircraft in Class E, you are in uncontrolled airspace. Now the UK doesn't really use Class E for that. The UK uses Class G instead, and Class G is uncontrolled for everybody. You may find a radar-equipped controller that will give you traffic information, but fundamentally it's uncontrolled airspace. You can encounter anything out there. You can be cruising along in IFR conditions and have military aircraft fly by. You can have gliders, you can have paragliders, you can have absolutely anything because the airspace is completely uncontrolled. And that's the fundamental difference, that when I leave controlled airspace, you can see on the routing that I've got at the moment, as I route down here, as I cross this line here, I'll be in uncontrolled airspace. Now it's okay for me to fly IFR in uncontrolled airspace, there's no problem doing that. But once I've left controlled airspace, I don't have an automatic right to rejoin. I would need to get the air traffic controller's approval or permission to re-enter controlled airspace. It's not so difficult in Scotland because there's a lower traffic density, and largely speaking the controllers you speak to outside controlled airspace are also able to give you clearance inside controlled airspace. But in the more busy parts in southern England that's not the case. The controllers you speak to outside controlled airspace are simply there to deal with requests for things like the altimeter setting or weather at a certain airfield. It's called a flight information service, whereas in Scotland it's a information and control sector on the one frequency. That makes it just a little bit different. So you can see on the map here that this is red. This is Class A airspace, and we use Class A to protect commercial traffic. So where we've got an airway, like the equivalent to a Victor airway, which in the US in Class E airspace would be controlled and protected, because we're in Class G airspace, there isn't that same protection. So airways in the UK are protected by a corridor of controlled airspace. It's Class A here and Class D there. Now you'll notice on the Laminar G1000 implementation that it's indicating blue here and it's red on the VFR map that I've created. The reason for that is because the Laminar G1000 implementation will not show, or doesn't appear to be able to show, Class A airspace. So I had to edit the airspace definitions and make all the Class A airways Class B airways to make them show. On the real G1000 you can control what's shown on the display, but we have to kind of fit this around what Laminar have coded. And that shows you just how different it is in the UK, that having Class A airspace down at 3,000 or 4,000 feet is just not something you would have expected. It sounds more complicated than it really is though. In practice at high altitude, above flight level 195, you get Class C everywhere. So that's just the same as flying above flight level 180 in the US, to all intents and purposes. It's only really at the intermediate, low to intermediate altitudes where you have this in and out of controlled airspace issue. And it's just, the only thing you need to keep in mind is when you leave controlled airspace, as we're about to do, you don't have any automatic right of rejoin. You've got to get a clearance to rejoin. But the controllers are usually quite helpful. They'll tell you what you need to do, as long as you remember you need to speak to somebody.
Mike Bravo Mike, you are leaving controlled airspace. Basic service.
Mike Bravo Mike, no further service required. Request frequency change en route.
Mike Bravo Mike. Okay, no known traffic to affect. My service terminates. Squawk 2000. Scottish information available. 124.5. Frequency change approved. Bye now.
Thank you very much. Squawk 2000 and frequency change approved. Have a great day. Mike Bravo Mike, bye now.
Bye now.
Excellent. So leaving controlled airspace, what I'll do is change the transponder. So we'll change the code to 2000, the IFR conspicuity code, and there's Scottish listening on COM2. That'll probably do us for the pretend air traffic control. Obviously, having had an 8-year-old at home for 5 or 6 weeks with no school to go to, she's been keen on getting involved in YouTube. Better to be a pretend air traffic controller than yet another Minecraft channel on YouTube, so she did enjoy that. But the fundamental message is that inside controlled airspace you are controlled, and now we're outside controlled airspace, we can do what we want. And that's what I hope to get across with the simulated air traffic control. So let's concern ourselves now with the flight down towards Dundee. I know that at 40 miles from the Alpha Delta November, I'm going to turn right and intercept the NDB. In fact, let's look at the approach chart for Dundee. I've also georeferenced the approach chart so that we can see the aircraft symbol on it as we get a bit closer. We're going to go down and intercept or head towards the DND on 394. So I need to tune that. I'll come here, I'll go to ADF DME, 394 is already in the standby, enter to change it over. So that's the ADF ready to go. Notice the VOR will present the identification code visually, but with the NDB we have to listen to it. I'm going to fly down, intercept the outbound, or the track outbound on 255, turn around and then fly the approach again. The approach is down ILS, so India Delta Delta Echo on 108.1. We've got that on the standby frequencies. And rather than landing easterly on runway 09, I'm going to break off to the south and fly a circling approach back onto runway 27. That should become quite straightforward. Or it should be quite straightforward when we get there. We need to be aware of the terrain as well. Within 25 miles of the NDB Delta November Delta, 4.4 is 4,400 feet, and within 10 miles, 2.9. Now firstly, if you know a way of getting a distance from an NDB, please put it in the comments section, because I have no idea how you would actually do that. It just doesn't exist. Unless you've got a co-located DME, which DND does not have, you can't do it. So we'll use the GPS for that. Notice now that I've got an indication from the ADF. It's notorious for pointing at the wrong thing. We need to try and ident it. So I'll turn on the audio and listen to see if I get a code. Now there's nothing there just yet, but that doesn't matter. My flight plan said 40 miles. I'll identify it before I use it in anger, but given that I'm above the minimum safe altitude, I'm happy to take a turn towards it. I'm going to pre-arm a heading of 230 degrees, and when we turn at 40 DME from the Aberdeen, I want you to watch this needle and how it relates to that heading pointer, because there's an important ADF NDB concept in there. And you see we're entirely outside controlled airspace now at lower levels. So, just approaching 40 miles. Watch the needle and the heading pointer. It's been fairly stable. I go into heading mode. Now, as the aircraft rolls, there's an error introduced on that ADF. You can see it's way off course now. That's an error called ADF dip, and it's very common with small airplanes. Larger aircraft have that compensated out. But with the VOR, it's reading a bit of information in the signal that identifies which radial it's on, whereas the ADF is an automatic direction finder. There's an antenna mounted under the aircraft, and it finds the heading, or finds the course, the direction, to the non-directional beacon. For it to work, the wings must be level. It just doesn't work properly otherwise. Anyway, on the heading, I'm going to change the frequency over so that we've got the ILS available. And what I'm going to do is do what any pilot would do in this case. I'm going to change the CDI over to the GPS. I'm going to bring up my flight plan, and the Delta November Delta is the initial approach fix as well. So if I bring up the proc button there, and I'm going to use activate approach. Remember, activate approach takes me to the initial fix. Activate vectors to final will sequence it down to final approach fix. So activate approach is what I want in this case. I'll check, we've got direct DND, I'll put it in nav mode. That says I'm 15 miles away from the DND, so 4,500 feet is a safe altitude. I'll put 4.5, I'll put it into VNAV, so there's VPath, And as I said on the ground at Aberdeen, I've already sorted out the vertical profile. So I'm using the altitude select to keep us terrain safe and to comply with the procedure altitudes, and I'm simply using the 2200 feet here at the Charlie India 09 point to drive to create a sensible vertical navigation path. Before I start the descent, I want to see if I can hear this ADF, this NDB. That is DND. We can see the Morse code ident on there as well. So that's acceptable. Now, Dundee is an airfield or an airport that is outside controlled airspace. It's just down on the coast here. Although it's outside controlled airspace, there would be an approach controller at Dundee. One of the oddities of the UK system, and something that really limits the usability of an aircraft like the TBM, is that we cannot do instrument approaches without an approach controller. So doing an instrument approach into an uncontrolled field is not possible in the UK. There has to be an approach controller. So doing an instrument approach to an airfield out of hours, again, that's not possible because there needs to be an approach controller. It's one of the quirks that makes it quite difficult to use an aircraft like this as a business aircraft. 1 minute from the top of descent. Now I'm also checking my inbound track. It's 232, which is within 30 degrees of 255, which means I can go straight over the beacon and beacon outbound. If it was more than 30 degrees off on either side, I would have to fly a hold entry procedure to align and then go out beacon outbound. So just about to start the descent. I'm actually only 8 miles from the DND now, so rather than stopping at 4,500, I can go down to the procedure initial altitude of 3,000 feet, and that's also terrain safe as well. But by this point I would obviously be speaking to the Dundee controller. Now remember, as we intercept the path, the vertical path, I need to bring the torque back. I'm going to try and keep us at 180 knots, just for a little bit, and then I'll bring the power back and we'll slow down. I'll fly the teardrop procedure at approximately 140 knots, and then we'll slow down and get the aircraft fully configured with the landing gear and landing flap before we descend on the ILS glide slope. The reason I'm going to do that is to keep it just a little bit slower, to give me more time to chat about what we're going to do. But also, if it's an airfield you're not familiar with, there's no reason at all to be doing everything at high speed. Slow the aircraft down, have a think about it, and keep it safe. So I'll bring the torque off now, and that'll have us slowing down to about 140 knots. If you're in icing conditions in the TBM 900, with the flaps up, you cannot go below 135 knots. With the flaps to takeoff, you cannot go below 115 knots. With flaps full, you shouldn't go below 95 knots in icing conditions. It's kind of written down as in the aircraft manual that those speeds should keep you safe in icing conditions. So something to be aware of there. I'll do it 140 flaps up, and that should simulate the speeds we'd need to fly in icing conditions. I'm also going to move the heading pointer around to 255, just as an indication of where we should end up. You can see the aircraft is just approaching the Delta, November Delta just now. So there's around about 140 knots. I'll bring the torque up to try and hold it there. So, starting the procedure, I'll put the inertial separator on, and we've got the landing lights on. Just need a little bit more power to maintain that speed. So we are now overhead the beacon, still at 4,000 feet because V path is still working, but I'm okay to descend with the procedure down to 2,200 feet. So I would tell the air traffic control, or the approach controller, that we're beacon outbound and descending with the procedure. I'm also monitoring it using the ADF, so the ADF is directly behind us, which means the aircraft is tracking nicely out on here. That's a bing for the inertial separator. Now, I'm not going to tell you the entire circling process up front. We're just going to try and stay one step ahead of the aircraft. In a few days' time, there should be an extra video uploaded that goes into the circling in a little bit more detail so that we can talk it through without actually having to do it at the same time. Circling is a procedure you've got to be very, very careful with. If you're going to an airport that you're likely to circle at, make sure that you thoroughly brief the circling approach before you start the engine on the aircraft. Even doing it to crew on a highly automated aircraft, it takes a fair amount of briefing to make sure you're going to do circling safely. An ILS is straightforward, circling isn't quite so straightforward. On the TBM 900, I'm going to make a lot of use of the automation to keep it sensible and easy for us here. So I'm using the DME from the ILS, so although it's 8 miles, it's not 8 miles from the DND, it's 8 miles from the runway itself. As we start the turn,
vertical track.
that's fine. As we start the turn, I'm going to select the first stage of flaps and allow the aircraft to slow down, no less than 115 knots in that configuration. It's about to start the turn, select flaps to take off, and as it starts to turn, I'm also going to spin the heading bug around onto the runway heading itself, the 092. The reason being is I'm going to leave the aircraft to automatically swap over from GPS to localizer presentation. Okay, we've got India Delta Delta Echo. It should change automatically. At the moment we're navigating to Charlie India 09. It should change when we are navigating to Fox India 09. So there's 120 knots. Tell air traffic control we're in the base turn. They'll clear us for the ILS. Halfway around the turn, I'll put the gear down. I'll just give it a little bit more power because I need to maintain 115 knots at the minimum. And now keep an eye on those flight mode initiators. So it's rolling out, it's targeting the Fox India, still in GPS mode. Now it's failed into roll mode, that's fine. I'll arm the approach, and this looks like a reasonable intercept heading. It should capture the localizer before the glide slope. Just a fraction slow. I'll take landing flap now, and I'll keep the aircraft above 95 knots. So I've got localizer engaged. We should get the glide slope any second. There's glide slope. I'll set 3000 for the missed approach. Now I'll let the aircraft come back to 95 knots or so on the ILS. We've got a little bit of time to talk about what comes next. So I'm finished with this display now, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom it in so that my ring around the aircraft is 0.75 nautical miles. I'm going to bring up the timer and reset it so that I can start timing the circling procedure. I'm also going to put the heading bug around on a 45-degree initial turn, so 137. We can just about use this 45-degree index. So my circling minima on this approach is 750 feet. Rather than circle at 750 feet, I'm going to circle at 800. And I think 800 is a fairly reasonable altitude in the TBM 900. Circling is all about setting safe minimums for yourself, and if the published chart gives you a low minimum and you're not happy flying to it, then simply fly to a higher minima. That's the reason we plan flights with diversion airfields, because we don't want to put ourselves in a situation of having to do something that we're not comfortable doing. I've got landing gear down with 3 greens, flaps to landing, and we've got the landing lights on. Field elevation is sensible. So as we get to 800 feet, I'm going to push the Alt button to level the aircraft to 800 feet. I'm going to bring the torque up to maintain 90 knots. That torque figure is going to be about 45%. I'm going to push the heading bug to turn right 45 degrees and start the timer and run it for 45 seconds. So level off, 45 torque, 45 heading, 45 seconds. We'll try and keep this as straightforward as possible. Again, in a 2-crew aircraft, with all the automation available, we would still make the maximum use of the automation on the aircraft. It's a visual procedure. You can't get away from the fact you need to see the runway and you need to stay within visual reference of the runway. But by all means use every capability the aircraft has to make it as easy as possible. There's 100 feet to go. So push to level off, Alt 810, that's fine. Torque is coming up, 45%. I'm going to start the turn with heading and start the timer. 45%, 45 degrees and running for 45 seconds. I'm going to check the speed as we turn, and we should be doing it all at 90 knots. So 345s and 190. It's very difficult to judge distances in the sim. You'll find that difficult flying circuits, I certainly do. However, we can use this ring around here to judge how far crosswind we are from the runway. When it gets to 45 seconds on the timer, I'm going to turn left onto the runway heading of 092 degrees, so basically flying downwind. There we go, so turning. And established. So I'm going to reset the timer just now, double check the speed, make sure that we're not going to fly into anything obviously. As I said, it's a visual procedure. Looking at this 0.75, it's just outside the runway and that's perfect. We're about 0.8 of a mile cross track. So we're exactly where we need to be. Okay, I was slightly early starting the timer, so I went to 47 seconds rather than 45. The next thing we need to do is as we cross the touchdown point, we need to start the timer again and run it for another 45 seconds. As soon as the end of the runway passes under the leading edge, that's close enough. We're on speed on the downwind. So, timer's running, 45 seconds. I'm going to use that 45 seconds to move the viewpoint around just a little bit so that I can see the V bar here for the aircraft position, the torque and the timer. We need to turn the autopilot off, the flight directors off and check the trim. I'll start doing that around about 35 seconds. In the real aircraft you may not use the autopilot for this, you may decide to fly it manually. It is easier to fly it manually. The keyboard and mouse, it's a bit harder to get all the controls. So autopilot's coming out, flight director's off. 45 seconds, I shall bank to 20 degrees, 25 degrees, and I'm going to lower the nose for around about 350 to 400 feet per minute. I'm going to bring the power back to prevent getting too fast. So 90 knots is fine. I'm going to keep the angle of attack indicator up here in the scan because that can save my life. I need to be aware of that at all times. So coming around the corner, I can see the Pappies at Dundee. That's looking sensible. I've got 3 reds, not unexpected. It's slightly steeper, the Pappies. They're set for 3.75 degrees. So I'll just reduce the vertical speed ever so slightly and then lower the nose. I need to make sure that we're in trim and we'll start coming back to 85 knots. Now Dundee is a narrow runway. It's only 30 meters rather than the standard international runways of 45 meters. And also the approach path on the Pappies is slightly steeper. So just something to be aware of. Speed's coming back, small movements on the power. Remember, there's a big propeller on the front of the aircraft, so we want to make little movements on the thrust lever. Ignoring the pappies now, it's a visual manoeuvre. Just arresting the rate of descent ever so slightly, and then into the flare. Power off, hold the attitude, touch down, lower the nose, and into, we'll use max reverse just for a second. And then before we go below 40 knots, back into the taxi range. I have to backtrack at Dundee, so I'll use a little bit of wheel braking. Speed's down below 10 knots, I'll make a turn. Off towards one side, and then turn back. We should end up on the centre line, or just outside it. And we'll taxi in. Now I'll not touch anything on the aircraft. I'm on an active runway. I want to get the aircraft onto the taxiway before we do anything else. So we'll just concentrate on the environment, concentrate on what's happening with air traffic control, and we'll take it from there. We'll turn off here. We'll get onto the parallel taxiway, we'll set the parking brake, and we'll sort the aircraft out. Again, fairly narrow taxiway, so it's not somewhere I'd be really comfortable taxiing and doing a lot of checks. Obviously if we taxi nice and slowly, it's okay. But what I'm going to do is come to a halt. I'll set the parking brake, reset flight idle, and cancel the caution for the parking brake. I'll bring the flaps to up, we'll set the pitot and the pitot stall heaters off, make sure that the light is set to taxi, transponder's fine, and we'll just double check. I don't think I put the radar on, so traffic standby and the radar is off. We're ready to taxi in. Rather than taxi in, we'll have a look on the outside. I'll just zoom out a little bit for the noise, and then we'll have a chat about that circling approach. So the ILS was straightforward, very similar to what we did at Aberdeen, except we left the aircraft to activate the localizer mode by itself. I wanted to demonstrate that it can be done. However, my experience with the TBM in X-Plane would suggest that it's better to always do your final intercept in heading mode and arm or change to localizer mode yourself. It just makes it a little bit neater on the process. But other than that, the ILS was straightforward. We thought about the number 45 3 times. We had an initial heading of 45 degrees from the instrument approach track or from the runway track. When we leveled off, we set 45% torque, and before starting the turn, we ran a timer for 45 seconds. 45 torque, 45 degrees, 45 seconds. When that 45 seconds was up, we turned left by another 45 degrees and tracked downwind, looking for about 0.75 to 0.8 of a mile cross track as we went downwind. Passing the landing threshold, we ran the timer again for 45 seconds and we turned in using 20-degree angle of bank and 350 to 400 feet per minute. But remember, it's a visual maneuver. You do it with visual references. It's more difficult in the sim because constantly moving your eye point around means that you end up with it's essentially spatial disorientation. Or I find that anyway. In the real aircraft, in a Category C A320, flying a circling approach, we'd still use as much of the automation as possible. The final turn on, the base turn, is done manually, but the initial turn and the downwind leg is done on autopilot, exactly as you saw me do with the TBM. Now, as I said, there'll be another video coming up that looks at circling in a little bit more detail. It's not something to attempt unless you understand what you're doing. It's certainly something that in the real world pilots treat with an awful lot of respect. I hope that makes sense. If you do have any questions about it, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I do hope you'll tune in for part 4 of the flying series when we're going to do some circuits at Dundee, some traffic pattern work at Dundee. Again, thanks very much for listening, and I hope to speak to you again soon.